On December 17, 1944, somewhere east of Boulingen, Belgium, a German grenadier dropped into an American foxhole that was still warm. The G1s had left in a hurry. Their sleeping bags were still there, their ration boxes were still there. And the smell! The grenadier hadn't smelled anything like it in over a year. It was coffee. Real coffee. Not the acorn and barley dust the Wehrmacht had been handing out since 1943. Real, actual American coffee, still warm in a canteen cup wedged between two logs. He picked up the cup. He drank it. And then he looked around. There was a cardboard box with English writing on it. Inside, a small tin of processed cheese, 4 cigarettes, machine-rolled, clean, dry, wrapped in cellophane, a chocolate bar, a compressed fruit bar, sugar, chewing gum, a tiny folded packet of toilet paper, a wooden spoon, and a second packet of coffee, powdered, instant, ready to dissolve in hot water. This was not an officer's cache. This was not a supply depot. This was the personal daily ration of a single American private. The grenadier held the chocolate bar. He turned it over in his fingers. He hadn't seen chocolate since he couldn't remember when. None of his friends had. His own rations that morning had been a piece of hard bread with a scrape of margarine and a cup of ersatz coffee that tasted like burnt dirt. He had eaten the same thing the day before, and the day before that. Now here he was, holding what one American threw away. He didn't know it yet. None of them did. But what he found in that foxhole would do more damage to the Wehrmacht than the artillery barrages that followed. If the story of what American soldiers built and left behind grabs you, a like and a subscribe help it reach more people who care about this history. Here is what you need to understand about what happened in the Ardennes and across the entire Western Front from Normandy to the Rhine to make sense of why abandoned American camps broke the German soldier before a shot was fired. By December 1944, the German infantryman lived inside a lie. Goebbels told him Germany was winning. The Wehrmachtbericht, the daily military communique broadcast on German radio, reported successful front corrections and heavy enemy losses. Officers repeated the party line. Wonder weapons were coming, the Allies would fracture, the Reich would endure. The average Lancer in his foxhole had no newspapers, no outside information, no way to verify what he was told. All he had was what his own eyes could see. And for most of 1944, what his eyes could see was an ever-shrinking perimeter of mud, cold, and hunger. But propaganda has a weakness. It works only as long as reality doesn't contradict it loudly enough. You can tell a man his side is winning. You can tell him the enemy is soft, decadent, poorly led. You can tell him every retreat is a strategic repositioning. And he might believe you, as long as the only evidence he encounters supports the story. The moment he touches something that contradicts the story starts to crack. And once it cracks, it cannot be repaired. Not by speeches, not by threats, not by anything. What cracked it was not a bomb, not a tank, not an artillery shell. It was a cardboard box the size of a man's hand. Remember that, because that box and everything inside it is the center of this story. To understand what that box meant to the German soldier who found it, you need to know what his world looked like by late 1944. Not the general's world, not the strategist's world, the world of the man in the hole. What he ate, what he wore, what he was promised, and what he actually received. The Wehrmacht had started the war in 1939 with a field ration of roughly 4,500 calories. Bread, sausage, butter, real coffee, tobacco. Not luxurious, but solid. By the standards of most European armies, the German soldier in 1939 ate well. Officers and enlisted men received the same ration, a policy the Wehrmacht enforced almost without exception. By 1942, the cracks had already appeared. Real coffee vanished from the supply chain. Germany had been importing its coffee from South America, and the Allied naval blockade severed that lifeline the same way the British blockade had severed it in 1916. What replaced it was Ersatz, a word that would become the quiet anthem of the German war effort. Roasted barley, ground acorns, chicory root, mixed with a coal tar extract to approximate the color. It was dark, it was hot, it tasted like punishment. And that was just the beginning. By 1944, the standard Wehrmacht ration had been cut repeatedly. Meat and fat were disappearing, replaced by potatoes and dried vegetables. On the home front, civilian calorie intake, which had been roughly 2,500 calories at the start of the war, dropped to 1,670 by the winter of 44-45. Soldiers in the field were supposed to receive more. In practice, supply chains were being shredded by Allied air power, and what was authorized on paper rarely arrived in the foxhole. The German soldier knew this. He felt it in his stomach every day, but he didn't know what the other side looked like. He had never seen inside an American foxhole. Until December 1944, when Hitler launched his last gamble in the Ardennes, and 200,000 German soldiers surged forward into territory the Americans had just been living in. What they found there is one of the least told stories of the entire war. And it begins not with a battle, but with a cardboard box. The K-ration was designed in 1941 by a physiologist named Ansel Keys at the University of Minnesota. The Army told him they needed a single box that could fit in a soldier's cargo pocket, survive temperatures from -20 to 135 degrees Fahrenheit, require no preparation, and keep one man combat effective for one day. Keys delivered it in under a year. But none of that matters for this story. What matters is what was inside. 3 boxes per day: breakfast, dinner, supper. Each one wax-coated, waterproof, the size of a Cracker Jack box. And each one packed with items that, to an American GI in 1944, were ordinary, unremarkable, sometimes even annoying. Soldiers complained constantly that K-rations were bland, repetitive, monotonous. They traded them, threw them away half-eaten, used the boxes as kindling. Now picture the same box through the eyes of a man who has been eating hard bread and turnip soup for 5 months. The breakfast unit alone contained a small tin of chopped ham and eggs, biscuits, a compressed fruit bar, a packet of instant coffee with sugar, 4 cigarettes, and toilet paper. Think about that for a moment. The American Army issued toilet paper in a combat ration to every soldier, every day. The German Army in 1944 could not reliably supply ammunition to its frontline troops. The Americans were supplying toilet paper. That single detail tells you more about the difference between the two armies than any battlefield analysis ever could. The dinner unit had canned cheese or processed meat, more biscuits, powdered bouillon, a hot broth a soldier could make in his canteen cup, sugar, more cigarettes, chewing gum. The supper unit had a different meat tin, another chocolate bar or caramels, more coffee, more cigarettes. And here is the number that needs to sit with you. Each K-ration, 1 day's worth for one soldier, contained roughly 2,800 calories. Compact, sealed, ready to eat. No cook, no kitchen, no supply truck required. The German civilian at home was surviving on 1,670. So when a German grenadier opened that box in a frozen foxhole in Belgium, he wasn't just finding food. He was finding proof that everything he had been told was wrong. Goebbels had told him the Americans were soft, decadent, unable to fight. But soft, decadent nations do not design combat rations with this kind of precision. They do not wrap each cigarette in cellophane. They do not include a wooden spoon and a can opener in a box the size of a man's hand. This was not decadence. This was engineering. And the grenadier could feel the difference in his fingers. But the K-ration was only the surface. Hold that thought, because what happened next, when German units didn't just find single rations, but entire supply dumps, was something else entirely. First, I need to take you back 26 years. Because what happened in the Ardennes in December 1944 had happened before, almost exactly, and the first time it helped end a world war. March 21, 1918, the Kaiserschlacht, the Kaiser's Battle, Germany's last great offensive of the First World War. 76 divisions smashed through British lines on a 50-mile front in northern France. The stormtroopers advanced faster than anyone expected. British units broke, rear areas fell, and within days, the leading German infantry reached something they had not seen in 4 years of war: British supply depots. The accounts are consistent across multiple sources. German soldiers, half-starved after years of the Allied naval blockade, poured into abandoned British rear positions and stopped fighting. Not because they were ordered to, Not because they were defeated, because they found rum, white bread, tinned beef, cigarettes, butter, marmalade. Things that had disappeared from Germany years earlier. Things their own government told them the enemy didn't have. Officers screamed at them to keep moving. The stormtroopers, the most elite soldiers in the Kaiser's army, sat down in British dugouts, opened British tins, and ate. Some units lost entire hours. Some lost entire days. The Great Offensive, the one that was supposed to win the war, slowed not because of British resistance, but because German soldiers discovered that the enemy they'd been told was starving was eating better than they were. A German officer wrote afterward that his men had been seized by what he called a kind of madness. Not rage, not fear, something quieter. The realization, arriving all at once through the stomach rather than the mind, that the war could not be won. Remember that phrase, through the stomach rather than the mind, because that is the key to this entire story. The German High Command in 1918 understood what had happened. They studied it. They wrote reports about it. They concluded that the sight of enemy abundance had been as demoralizing as a defeat in battle, and they swore it would never happen again. 26 years later, it happened again. Only this time, the abundance was not British, it was American, and it was on a scale that the men of 1918 could not have imagined. Because the British Empire in 1918 was stretched thin, rationing at home, struggling to keep its supply lines open across the Channel. What German soldiers found in British depots was a country fighting near its limit, maintaining its army by will and organization. The United States in 1944 was not fighting near its limit. It was not even close to its limit. And the things German soldiers found in abandoned American camps reflected that difference, not in degree, but in kind. What those camps contained, and what it told the German soldier about the enemy he was fighting, is something no propaganda ministry on earth could have prepared him for. And the story of how that abundance was created begins not on a battlefield, but on an assembly line in a place called Willow Run, Michigan, where a single factory, under a single roof, was doing something that the entire German Reich could not match. Here is a number I want you to carry with you for the rest of this story: 750. That is how many tons of supplies a single American division consumed per day in the European theater. Not in a week, not in a month, per day. General Omar Bradley wrote it plainly in his memoirs. 28 divisions advancing across France and Belgium, each requiring 700 to 750 tons daily. A total daily appetite of 20,000 tons, just for the Americans, just on the Western Front. Now. The German army reckoned its divisions needed roughly 200 tons per day, and by late 1944, most German divisions were not getting even that. Allied bombers had shredded the rail network, fuel was vanishing. Horse-drawn wagons, yes, the Wehrmacht still relied heavily on horses in 1944, could not cover the distances fast enough. German supply officers were performing daily miracles just to get ammunition forward. Food, clothing, and medical supplies were afterthoughts. 750 tons versus 200. And the 200 was theoretical. The 750 was real. But here is what made the American number truly staggering. Those 750 tons didn't represent the limit of what America could produce. They represented what could be physically hauled to the front. The bottleneck was never the factory. It was always the road. In the summer and fall of 1944, the U.S. Army ran an operation called the Red Ball Express to solve that bottleneck. Nearly 6,000 trucks running day and night on dedicated one-way highways marked with red balls, hauling supplies from the Normandy beaches to the advancing armies. At its peak, the Express delivered 12,500 tons per day. Most of the drivers were African-American soldiers, working 20-hour shifts, sleeping in their cabs, driving blacked-out trucks through rain and fog on roads cratered by months of war. The Red Ball Express ran for 81 days. In that time, it moved over 412,000 tons of supplies. And when the Express was winding down, the ports of Antwerp and Marseille came online, and the supply chain only got bigger. This is what the German soldier was up against. Not just American courage, though there was plenty of that. Not just American firepower, though that was overwhelming. He was up against a system. A machine so large that it could pour 750 tons of food, fuel, ammunition, clothing, medical supplies, cigarettes, coffee, chocolate, chewing gum, toilet paper, and replacement parts into a single division every single day. And consider that routine. And here is the fact that will make that number real. By 1944, the United States was producing more than half of all manufactured goods on the planet. Not half of the Allied total, half of the world's total. American factories turned out 96,000 aircraft in 1944 alone, more than Japan produced in the entire war from 39 to 45. They built 2.4 million trucks, 100,000 tanks and armored vehicles, 41 billion rounds of ammunition, 124,000 ships of all types. At the Ford Motor Company's Willow Run plant outside Detroit, a factory so large that the building itself stretched nearly half a mile, workers were rolling a finished B-24 Liberator bomber off the assembly line every 60 minutes at peak production. One heavy bomber every hour from a single building. Now, all of those numbers are impressive on paper, but paper didn't break the German soldier's will. What broke his will was what those numbers looked like when they arrived in a field in Belgium. Because the American supply system didn't just deliver what soldiers needed, it delivered more than soldiers could use. And what soldiers couldn't use, they left behind. This is the critical point. Pay attention to this. When an American unit moved forward, it left behind everything it didn't want to carry. Not because Americans were wasteful by nature, though the Army's logistics manuals actually accounted for a standard percentage of wastage in every supply calculation. But because the system was so vast, so continuous, so relentless in its flow, that there was no reason to hold on to anything. If you left your extra K rations in a foxhole, more would arrive tomorrow. If you abandoned a case of cigarettes, another case was already on a truck somewhere in France. If your sleeping bag got muddy, a replacement was in the pipeline. The American soldier did not hoard. He had no reason to. And he had been trained in an army that valued speed over conservation. Move fast, travel light, leave what slows you down. The supply chain will catch up. For the German soldier, the concept was incomprehensible. In the Wehrmacht, you carried everything you owned. If you lost your mess kit, you might not get another one for weeks. If your boots wore out, you pulled boots off a dead man, sometimes a dead American. Every bullet was accounted for. Every ration was rationed. Every piece of equipment was irreplaceable. So when a German soldier walked into an abandoned American camp and saw what had been left behind, not hidden, not buried, not booby-trapped, just left, casually, the way a man leaves a newspaper on a park bench, he was not looking at garbage. He was looking at the answer to a question he had not yet asked. And the question was this: if the enemy can afford to throw this away, what does he still have? That question, once it entered a soldier's mind, could not be removed. And in the Ardennes, in December 1944, it entered the minds of tens of thousands of German soldiers in a matter of days. Because what they found went far beyond a few ration boxes in a foxhole. What some of them found were things that made hardened veterans, men who had survived Stalingrad and Kursk, sit down in the snow and weep. In the first 3 days of the Ardennes offensive, German forces pushed forward as much as 50 miles in some sectors. The American line buckled, units scattered. And as German infantry swept through the positions that 80,000 American soldiers had been living in just hours before, they entered a world that contradicted everything they knew. It was not just the food, it was everything. A German grenadier entering an evacuated American command post would find Coleman stoves still warm, cots with actual mattresses, electric torches with fresh batteries, stacks of wool blankets, clean, dry, with no holes, raincoats, winter jackets lined with pile fabric, rubber overshoes designed to fit over combat boots and keep feet dry in snow. He would find medical kits, not the company medical kits issued to a medic for an entire platoon, individual medical kits, one per soldier. Each one containing a packet of sulfonamide powder to pour directly into an open wound, a compress bandage in a sealed wrapper, and in some cases a morphine syringe, a small tube of painkiller with a needle attached, designed so a wounded man could inject himself without waiting for a medic. Think about what that meant to a German infantryman in December 1944. By that point in the war, Wehrmacht medical supplies were nearly exhausted. Frontline units were reusing bandages. Medics were performing surgery without anesthetic. Wounded men were dying of infections that a 5-cent packet of sulfa powder could have prevented. The German medical system, once one of the finest in the world, had been ground down to almost nothing by 5 years of war on multiple fronts. And here was an army that gave every single private, every rifleman, every cook, every truck driver, his own personal medical kit. Sealed, sterile, ready. The clothing hit almost as hard. By the winter of '44, German soldiers on the Western Front were wearing whatever they had. Some still wore summer tunics. Many had no winter boots. Gloves, scarves, and thermal underwear were luxuries that had stopped arriving months ago. The Wehrmacht supply system was supposed to distribute winter equipment, but between Allied air attacks on rail lines and the simple fact that Germany was running out of raw materials, most of it never reached the front. The Americans, by contrast, had a problem the Germans could not even comprehend. The US Army had actually been slow to order winter clothing, not because it couldn't produce it, but because planners in the summer of '44 believed the war would be over before winter arrived. When that turned out to be wrong, the Quartermaster Corps scrambled, and within weeks, massive shipments of winter gear were flowing across the Atlantic. The system corrected itself. That was the terrifying part. The Americans made a mistake, and the machine simply adjusted. So the German soldier found American winter jackets, and American rubber overshoes, and American wool socks piled in crates, sometimes still sealed, sometimes ripped open and scattered, because the Americans had gotten more than they needed and left the excess behind. And then there were the things that had no military value at all. Playing cards, paperback novels, magazines with photographs of women in bathing suits, razor blades, soap, actual soap, not the gritty sand and fat substitute the Wehrmacht issued, toothbrushes, writing paper and envelopes pre-stamped for free postage home. One by one, each of these items was small, trivial, the kind of thing an American GI would toss aside without a second thought. But together, they painted a picture that was devastating in its clarity. This was an army that cared whether its soldiers could shave. An army that thought a man fighting in a frozen forest should be able to brush his teeth. An army that believed a soldier's letter home was important enough to carry for free across an ocean. An army that had so much of everything that comfort items, items with zero tactical value, were standard issue. The German soldier had none of these things. He had not had them in a very long time. And he had been told, over and over, by his officers, by the radio, by every piece of propaganda that reached him, that Germany was the most powerful industrial nation in Europe, that German engineering was superior, that the enemy's strength was an illusion. Now he was holding American soap in one hand and a German ersatz coffee packet in the other, and his body knew the truth before his mind could form the words. Here is what happened next, and this is where the story turns from material into something far more dangerous for the Wehrmacht. The German army was built on discipline and unit cohesion. A man could be hungry, cold, and exhausted and still fight, as long as the men around him were fighting too. As long as the group held, the individual held. This was not unique to the Germans. It is how every army works. Morale is collective before it is personal. But what happens when every man in the unit has seen the same thing? Word traveled fast. A soldier who found American rations told the men in his squad. The squad told the platoon. By nightfall of the first day, entire companies knew. By the second day, entire battalions. And the conversation was always the same. Not shouted, not dramatic, quiet. Murmured between two men sharing a cigarette, often an American cigarette, taken from an American box, lit with an American match. The conversation went something like this. If they have this much, we cannot win. Not will not, cannot. And that word, cannot, was more dangerous to the German war effort than any weapon the Americans had yet deployed. Because a soldier who believes he will not win might still fight out of duty or fear or habit. But a soldier who believes he cannot win has already begun to calculate his surrender. What the German High Command did when they realized what was happening, and what they tried to do about it, is a story of panic dressed in the language of discipline. And it begins with an order that, in hindsight, might be the most quietly desperate document of the entire Ardennes offensive. German officers on the ground saw it happening in real time. You could watch it move through a unit the way cold moves through a body, starting at the extremities, working inward. First, the youngest replacements, the 16 and 17-year-olds who had been drafted in the autumn of '44 under Hitler's total mobilization decree, boys who had never fired a weapon in combat before the Ardennes. They were the most vulnerable because they had the least invested. They had no victories to remember, no unit pride built over years of campaigning. All they had was what they had been told in training, that German arms were superior, that the enemy was weak, that final victory was near. When they held an American chocolate bar that their own mothers hadn't seen in 3 years, the entire framework collapsed in their hands. Then it reached the veterans, and this was worse. Because the veterans didn't need a chocolate bar to start doing arithmetic. They had been watching the sky for months. They knew what American air superiority looked like, the endless formations of bombers overhead, the fighter bombers that appeared within minutes of any German vehicle moving in daylight. They had seen what American artillery could do, massed, coordinated, devastatingly accurate. They had been retreating since Normandy. The abandoned camps were not new information to these men. They were confirmation. And confirmation is the most dangerous form of demoralization, because it cannot be argued with. A rumor can be denied, a fear can be suppressed, but when a man who already suspected the truth suddenly holds the evidence in his hands, something locks into place that no officer's speech can unlock. Company commanders tried. They gave the standard talks about duty, fatherland, holding the line. Some threatened. Standing orders in the Wehrmacht by late '44 authorized summary execution for defeatism. A soldier caught spreading pessimism about the war's outcome could be shot on the spot, and thousands were. The Feldgendarmerie, the German military police, roamed the rear areas with broad authority, and any man found away from his unit without orders risked a noose and a sign around his neck reading deserter. But you cannot execute a mood. You cannot hang a feeling. And the feeling spreading through the German ranks in the Ardennes was not cowardice. These were men who had fought across Russia, across North Africa, across Italy. Many of them would continue fighting for weeks, even months. The feeling was something more precise than fear and more corrosive than doubt. It was the quiet, private recognition that the industrial gap between Germany and America was so vast that no amount of courage, no tactical brilliance, no wonder weapon could close it. We know what they said to each other, not from post-war memoirs written with the benefit of hindsight, but from conversations recorded in real time. Throughout the war, British intelligence operated a network of covert listening stations in prisoner of war camps, most notably at a country estate called Trent Park, north of London. German officers and soldiers captured on every front were housed together in comfortable conditions, deliberately comfortable, to encourage them to talk freely. Hidden microphones recorded everything. Every word was transcribed by teams of German-speaking British intelligence officers. After the war, the transcripts were classified. They sat untouched in archives for over 50 years. In 2001, a German historian named Zonka Neitzel walked into the British National Archives and found them, tens of thousands of pages. He later found an even larger collection, roughly 100,000 pages, at the National Archives in Washington. What those transcripts reveal is extraordinary. German soldiers, speaking privately to other German soldiers with no audience and no reason to perform, discussed the war with a candor that no memoir, no interrogation report, no official document could match. They talked about what they had done, what they had seen, what they believed, and again, they talked about American material abundance, not as an abstract concept, as a specific, physical, sensory experience. The coffee, the cigarettes, the clothing, the medical supplies, the trucks, an endless river of American trucks moving supplies forward, more trucks than the German army had vehicles of all types combined. The waste. Above all, the waste. The staggering, incomprehensible, spirit-crushing waste. One captured officer described entering an abandoned American position and finding stacked cases of canned rations, enough to feed his entire battalion for a week. Left behind, unopened, because the Americans had moved forward and fresh supplies were already waiting at the next position. He said that when his men saw it, several of them sat down and refused to move for nearly an hour. Not out of insubordination, out of something closer to shock. And here is the detail that cuts deepest. The Ardennes offensive, the operation Hitler had staked everything on, was designed from the start to capture American supplies. This was not a secret. It was the plan. The Wehrmacht did not have enough fuel to reach the Meuse River, let alone Antwerp. The entire operational concept depended on German spearheads seizing American fuel depots as they advanced.
Kampfgruppe Piper, the armored tip of the 6th SS Panzer Army, 4,800 men and 600 vehicles, diverted to the town of Bühlingen on the morning of December 17th, specifically to capture an American fuel dump. They found it, they refueled, and they kept going. But think about what that means. The most powerful armored formation in Hitler's last offensive could not function without American gasoline. The plan to defeat America required, as a prerequisite, using America's own fuel. The Germans were not fighting a war against American logistics. They were parasites on American logistics, and every man in those tank columns knew it. The offensive that was supposed to restore German morale was destroying it. One abandoned foxhole, one captured supply dump, one American chocolate bar at a time. And the worst was still coming. Because what happened when the offensive stalled and the weather cleared and the American machine fully engaged would teach the German soldier one final lesson about the nation he was fighting. A lesson not about what Americans could produce, but about how fast they could replace what was lost. On December 23, 1944, the weather broke. For 7 days, fog and low cloud had grounded the Allied air forces. It was the only reason the Ardennes offensive had gotten as far as it did. German tanks and infantry had moved in a world without air attack, a luxury they had not enjoyed since the spring of '43. For 1 week, the Wehrmacht remembered what it felt like to advance without looking up. Then the sky cleared, and the American machine came alive. On that single day, the 23rd, the 9th Air Force flew over 1,000 sorties against German positions. P-47 Thunderbolts, 8-ton fighter bombers carrying 2,000 pounds of ordnance under their wings, swept down on German columns caught in the open on narrow Ardennes roads. They hit fuel trucks, ammunition carriers, artillery positions, command vehicles. Kampfgruppe Piper, already stalled west of Stavelot with empty fuel tanks and no resupply route, was cut off permanently. The most feared armored formation in the offensive would never reach the Meuse. But the air attacks were only the visible part of what happened when the American system fully engaged. The invisible part, the part that mattered more for this story, was what happened behind the lines. The Ardennes offensive had cost the Americans dearly. Roughly 75,000 casualties, hundreds of tanks destroyed, enormous quantities of equipment lost or abandoned in the first chaotic days. By any normal military standard, the damage should have taken months to repair. It took weeks. 68 ships loaded with replacement tanks, trucks, artillery pieces, and ordnance stores were dispatched from the United States before Christmas. Replacement soldiers, 49,000 of them, were transferred from service units, retrained, and fed into the infantry pipeline. Ammunition depots that had been threatened by the German advance were reorganized and restocked. Fuel reserves were rebuilt. By the end of January 1945, barely 5 weeks after the offensive began, the American armies in Europe were stronger than they had been on December 15th. Stronger. Not recovered. Not rebuilt to previous levels. Stronger. Let that sink in. Germany threw everything it had left into the Ardennes. 250,000 men. 1,000 tanks. Hitler's final strategic reserve. And the result was that the American army emerged from the battle with more capability than it had going in. The blow that was supposed to break the Americans had been absorbed, metabolized, and converted into additional strength. For the German soldier, this was the final lesson, and it was being delivered not through propaganda leaflets dropped from planes, though the Allies dropped millions of those too, but through what he could see with his own eyes as the retreat began. Because now, the German army was moving backward. Through the same Belgian forests, the same villages, the same roads. And everywhere they looked, the evidence of American recovery was visible.
fresh tire tracks on roads the Germans had captured just days ago, new telephone wires strung along trees, supply trucks moving in convoys, not the desperate, scattered logistics of a wounded army, but the organized, scheduled deliveries of a system operating at full capacity. And in the positions the Americans reoccupied, the German soldier, now retreating through them, could see that the foxholes had already been restocked. New ration boxes, new ammunition crates, new sleeping bags to replace the ones that had been left behind the week before. The Americans had not just survived, they had refilled. A German Lancer who had eaten captured American chocolate on December 18th was now, on January 5th, watching American trucks haul more chocolate forward to replace it. The supply he had looted, the supply that had stunned him, that had shaken his faith, that had made him murmur to his friend that the war could not be won, was a rounding error. A minor fluctuation in a pipeline so vast that its loss was not even noticed. This is the moment where the story stops being about food and starts being about mathematics. Because the German soldier could now do the arithmetic himself, and the arithmetic was annihilating. Germany's losses in the Ardennes, 80,000 to 100,000 men, 800 tanks and assault guns, 1,000 aircraft, were irreplaceable. The factories producing Tiger and Panther tanks were being bombed daily. The fuel supply was collapsing, the manpower pool was exhausted. Germany was now drafting boys and old men. Every tank destroyed in the Ardennes was a tank that would never be replaced. Every veteran killed was replaced by a teenager with 6 weeks of training. The Americans lost comparable numbers of men and probably more equipment in the initial surprise, and replaced all of it within a month. Because behind the American front line stood a nation of 134 million people with an industrial base that was not only untouched by bombing, but was actually still growing. American gross national product had increased by 52% since 1939. Factories were running 3 shifts. And the Atlantic supply line, the great conveyor belt of Liberty ships and Victory ships carrying everything from Sherman tanks to chewing gum, had not been seriously threatened since the U-boat menace was broken in the spring of '43. The German soldier retreating through the Ardennes in January 1945 did not know these precise numbers. He did not need to. He could see the result. He had raided the American cupboard, and the cupboard had refilled overnight. He had struck the enemy with everything his nation had, and the enemy had shrugged it off and come back stronger. The abandoned camps had told him he could not win. The American recovery told him something worse, that his fighting, his suffering, his friends' deaths had not even dented the enemy's strength. And that is when the surrenders began. Not in a flood, not yet, but in a way that the Wehrmacht had not seen on the Western Front before. Quiet, calculated, deliberate surrenders by men who were not surrounded, not wounded, not out of ammunition. Men who simply concluded that continuing to fight was no longer a rational act. What those surrenders looked like, and what the men who surrendered carried with them, tells the final chapter of this story. And it begins with something a German sergeant kept in his breast pocket through the last winter of the war. In the spring of 1945, American intelligence officers processing German prisoners noticed something they had not seen before. It was small, easy to overlook, but once they started paying attention, they found it again and again. German soldiers were surrendering with American items in their pockets. Not weapons, not maps, not intelligence documents, small things. A packet of Nescafe instant coffee, still sealed. A crushed Hershey wrapper, empty but carefully folded. 3 Lucky Strike cigarettes, saved and rationed, 1 per day. A tin of processed cheese with the key still attached, unopened, kept not as food, but as proof. Proof that the man carrying it had seen the other side, that he knew what was there. One sergeant, captured near the Rhine in March '45, had a single American K-ration coffee packet in his breast pocket. He had been carrying it since the Ardennes, nearly 3 months. He had not opened it. When the American officer processing him asked why, the sergeant said he had kept it to remind himself every morning that the war was over. Not that it would be over, that it was already over. Had been over since the moment he found it in an empty foxhole east of Bullingen. He had spent the last 3 months going through the motions, waiting for the rest of Germany to realize what he had known since December. He was not unique. By the spring of 45, the German army on the Western Front was dissolving. Not collapsing under fire, dissolving. In March alone, over 300,000 German soldiers surrendered to the Western Allies. In April, the number exceeded that many times over. By the time the war ended on May 8th, the Americans and British held millions of German prisoners. Many of these men had fought bravely for years. Many had medals, wounds, combat records that would have earned respect in any army. They had not lost their courage. They had lost something more fundamental. They had lost the ability to believe that fighting served a purpose. And this is where the story connects to something larger than chocolate and coffee. The Allied Supreme Headquarters, SHAEF, had a psychological warfare division that spent the entire war trying to break German morale. They dropped millions of leaflets over German lines. They broadcast radio programs aimed at German troops. They designed safe conduct passes, small cards that a German soldier could carry and present upon surrender, promising fair treatment and adequate food. The passes were printed by the tens of millions and scattered from aircraft, stuffed into artillery shells, left in captured positions. The safe conduct passes worked. Post-war analysis showed that a significant percentage of German POWs had one on them when they surrendered. The Psychological Warfare Division considered them one of the most effective tools in the Allied arsenal. But here is the part they never fully acknowledged. The passes worked not because of what was printed on them. They worked because of what the German soldier had already seen with his own eyes. The pass promised food, shelter, medical treatment, fair handling. The German soldier believed the promise because he had already been inside the American system. He had held the evidence. He had eaten the chocolate. He had smelled the coffee. He knew that a nation capable of putting toilet paper and chewing gum into a combat ration was a nation capable of feeding its prisoners. The abandoned camp was the real safe conduct pass. The printed card was just the permission slip. This is the answer to the question in the title, and I want to state it plainly because it deserves to be stated plainly. Abandoned American camps made German soldiers give up before battle because those camps delivered a truth that no other source of information could deliver. Not a truth about American kindness or American values, a truth about American power. The sheer, overwhelming, industrial, logistical, productive power of a nation that could supply every single one of its soldiers with coffee, chocolate, cigarettes, soap, toilet paper, medical kits, warm clothing, and 3 full meals a day, and treat the loss of all of it as routine. For the German soldier who had been surviving on ersatz coffee and hard bread, who had been told by his government that Germany was the greatest industrial power in Europe, who had been promised that wonder weapons and final victory were just around the corner, that truth was annihilating. Because it was not an argument, it was not a claim, it was a physical object he could hold in his hand. And physical objects do not lie. Propaganda lies, officers lie, governments lie, but a chocolate bar does not lie. A packet of real coffee does not lie. A pair of dry wool socks does not lie. And when the truth arrives through the body, through the hands, the nose, the tongue, the stomach, it bypasses every defense the mind has built. Every wall of ideology, every layer of discipline, every structure of obedience. The German soldier did not decide to stop believing in victory. He discovered he had already stopped. The abandoned camp didn't change his mind. It revealed that his mind had already changed, and all that was left was for his body to follow. That is why abandoned American camps broke the German soldier before battle. Not because they were designed to, not because anyone planned it, but because the most devastating weapon in the American arsenal turned out to be something no one in Washington, no one in SHAEF, no one in the entire Allied command structure had thought of as a weapon at all. It was the garbage. The ordinary, unremarkable, everyday garbage of the best supplied army in the history of the world. And there is one more thing left to tell. A small thing, about a man and a cup of coffee, that closes this story where it began. December 17th, 1944, east of Boulingen, Belgium. The foxhole was still warm. The grenadier who dropped into it that morning was 20 years old, maybe 21. We do not know his name with certainty because he is not the kind of man who appears in official histories. He was not a general. He did not make a decision that altered the course of the battle. He was one of 200,000 German soldiers who moved forward that week into the Ardennes, following orders, doing what soldiers do. But we know what he found. We know because thousands of men found the same thing in hundreds of positions across an 80-mile front. And we know what it did to them because they told each other, in foxholes and dugouts and prisoner-of-war camps, for months and years afterward. He found a cup of coffee that was still warm. And that small detail, the warmth, mattered more than anything else. Because warmth meant the Americans had been here minutes ago, not hours, minutes. They had been sitting in this foxhole, drinking real coffee, and then they had gotten up and left. Not in panic. The position was orderly, the sleeping bag rolled, the ration boxes stacked. They had left the way a man leaves his kitchen table when it's time to go to work. Calmly.
Knowing he'll be back.
Knowing there is more where that came from. The warmth of that coffee said, "This army does not cling to things. This army moves through the world like water, and everything it needs flows with it." The grenadier drank the coffee, and the war inside him ended, even though the war around him had 4 months and 22 days left to run. Millions of German soldiers reached that same private ending at different moments between June of 44 and May of 45. For some, it happened on a beach in Normandy, when they saw the scale of the Allied fleet stretching to the horizon. For some, it happened in the hedgerows, when American artillery, coordinated by a fire direction system the Germans could not comprehend, dropped 100 shells on a single position within 3 minutes of a single radio call. For some, it happened on the Siegfried Line, or in the Hürtgen Forest, or along the Rhine. But for tens of thousands, it happened in the quietest possible way. Not under fire, not in defeat. In an empty foxhole, holding something small, something ordinary, something the enemy had not even bothered to take with him. When the war ended, over 11 million German soldiers passed through Allied captivity. Those who entered American prisoner-of-war camps encountered the same system from the other side. They were fed, adequately, sometimes well. They received medical treatment, clean clothing, soap, and coffee, real coffee, the same instant Nescafe their captors drank. Some of these men had not tasted real coffee in 3 years. Some of them cried when they drank it. Not from gratitude, not from relief. From the recognition that the gap between what they had been told and what was real had been even wider than they imagined. After the war, many of these men returned to Germany carrying something with them. Not American rations or American cigarettes, but a specific understanding. An understanding that the war had not been lost on the battlefield. It had been lost in the factory, the shipyard, the assembly line, the wheat field, the supply depot. It had been lost in the quiet, unglamorous, deeply American machinery of production and distribution that turned raw materials into a chocolate bar in a private's pocket 10,000 miles from the farm where the cocoa was grown. The German veterans did not often talk about this. It was not the kind of story that lent itself to pride or nostalgia. There was no heroism in it, no last stand, no brilliant maneuver, no defiant gesture. Just a man in a foxhole, holding a piece of chocolate, doing arithmetic in his head and arriving at an answer he could not escape. But it was the truth. And of all the truths the Second World War produced, about courage, about cruelty, about the capacity of ordinary people to endure extraordinary suffering, this one might be the quietest and the most important. The most powerful weapon the United States brought to the war was not the atomic bomb. It was not the B-17 or the Sherman tank or the P-51 Mustang. It was not even the bravery of the men who fought, though that bravery was real and should never be diminished. The most powerful weapon was the system that put real coffee in a cardboard box, sealed it in wax, shipped it across an ocean, trucked it to a frozen forest, and delivered it to a 20-year-old kid from Ohio who drank half of it and left the rest behind. Because he knew, without thinking about it, that there would always be more. That is why abandoned American camps made German soldiers give up before battle. Not the camps themselves, what the camps revealed. That behind every American soldier stood a nation so vast, so productive, so relentlessly organized that it could afford to be generous with its garbage. And for the German soldier holding that garbage in his hands, the war was already over. Thank you for staying with this story all the way to the end. It means a great deal. If this video taught you something you didn't know, or made you think about the war in a way you hadn't before, I would be grateful if you'd hit the like button. It is the single biggest thing you can do to help a story like this find the people who want to hear it. If you're not subscribed yet, I'd love to have you. Subscribe and tap the bell so you don't miss the next one. I'm curious, where are you watching from today? And if someone in your family served on the Allied side in the Second World War, a father, a grandfather, an uncle who landed on a beach or drove a truck or loaded a ship, I'd love to hear about them in the comments. Those men built the machine this story is about, and they deserve to be remembered. Thank you. I'll see you in the next one.